Okay, I guess we'll get going. So I'm Rachel Andrew, and I'm going to talk to you for the next sort of 45 minutes about Css Grid Layout. So if you're in my keynote, you realize I've been working on the web since '96, which makes me old enough to remember when CSS first became a thing. So my interest in the stuff that I'm going to talk about today and the stuff that I've been working on for the last few years really goes back to when I first started doing CSS stuff. And I was doing things with Dreamweaver and visually representing layout. And I've always been very interested in how we might do that. And our existing tools have been something of a letdown. So really, my interest in this goes back to then. So it's kind of not surprising that I've ended up kind of embroiled in layout stuff. Because the thing with CSS is that the stuff we can do today is pretty amazing. You know, things that we used to use Flash for, that we used to have to use JavaScript for, or stacks of sliced up images, we can now do directly with CSS in the browser. But layout kind of got itself stuck in about 2006. And essentially, we're using layout methods that were never designed for full-page layout of complex applications, things like floats, inline block positioning. They're kind of for sort of putting some images into academic documents. That was really where those things came from. They certainly weren't for web applications or responsive design. But we've got hope, and it comes in the form of a group of CSS modules that are really going to redefine how we do layout on the web. And that's Flexbox, which I'm sure many of you have already come across. We've got Css Grid, and we've also got something called the Box Alignment Level 3. I'm mostly going to talk about grid layout today, what that is, and how it's going to fundamentally change the web and how we do layout. I'll also talk a bit about browser support and things at the end. But there's a lot of code in this presentation. I'll give you the link to the slide, which has all the code links. They're all on CodePen, so don't worry about sort of copying down URLs as we go through. So I'll start by explaining a few things about grid layout. So first, we need to create a grid. And we create a grid using a new value of the display property. That's grid or inline grid. And immediately, any direct child of the element becomes a grid item. So that's the same as Flexbox. If you say display flex, any direct children become flex items. We can then create tracks on our grid by using new properties, grid template columns and grid template rows. So here I'm creating a 3-column and 3-row grid. And you can see that the child elements then just lay themselves out on the grid, one in each cell of the grid that's been created. If I want to space them out, we use a grid gap. Grid gap property is a shorthand for grid column gap and grid row gap. So you can specify those separately if you want different sized gaps. Now I'm creating fixed width columns here with pixels, but grid layout was created for a responsive web. So it allows the creation of flexible grids. And to do these flexible grids, we have this new unit, the FR unit. If you know how flex basis works in Flexbox, this should seem familiar. So what this does is it assigns a fraction of the available space to the track. So if you've got 3 1-fraction unit tracks, you get 3 flexible equal width tracks, and they'll grow and shrink in proportion. And if you want to change those proportions, you can assign different fractions to different tracks. So here I've got 2 tracks, each of 1-fraction unit and 1 of 2-fraction units. So the available space in the container is divided into 4. We get 1 part, and 2 parts. The nice thing about a unit that's used to assign an amount of available space means that we can mix it with fixed pixel size tracks if we want to. So I can say here I've got a 500 pixel width track, and then I've got a 1-fraction unit and a 2-fraction unit. So whatever space we've got in our container, we take away the 500 pixels and anything needed for the gap. Whatever's left, we'll divide that into 3 and share it out, 1 part and 2 parts. And if you've got a repeating pattern of tracks, you can use the repeat syntax. So this here is exactly the same as saying 1FR, 1FR, 1FR. Instead, I'm saying repeat 3 times 1-fraction unit. And that can be a pattern of tracks. It doesn't just have to be a single one. And we don't actually need to declare row tracks or even column tracks at all. If we leave them out, Grid will create rows or columns as needed for our items. So essentially, the grid that you define with grid template columns or grid template rows, that's what we call the explicit grid. We've created that grid, and then we're going to place things into it, or things will auto-flow into it. But if we place things outside of that grid, or if we don't have rows, for example, Grid will create them for us, and those are called the implicit grid. Implicit tracks will be auto-sized by default, so that means they'll take on the size of whatever content you put in them. You can specify a size with grid auto rows and grid auto columns, which means that you can actually give a size to these tracks that are created. And I showed you the repeat syntax, specifying a fixed number of repeating tracks. But you can also ask Grid to add as many tracks of a certain size as will fit into the container. And to do this, we use autofill or autofit as a keyword rather than using a number there. And you can even create flexible tracks. So in the last example, I was using an absolute width unit, which meant that you'd kind of get this jumping as it chose how many could fit in. If we use min-max, we can set the minimum size to 200 pixels, say, and the max to 1 fraction unit, meaning that Grid will assign the leftover space in proportion. So this is pretty neat. You can have a layout that remains in strict rows and columns, but also gives us as many columns as the container will support, and it will be responsive. So all of those things are about creating grids, actually creating the grid that we're going to put content in. I've not mentioned actually positioning anything on that grid yet. Everything that we've seen so far has been the auto-placement rules, just flowing the child elements into the grid that we've created. And we'll have another look at that in a little while about some of the things you can do with auto-placement. But generally, when you think about grids, you think about creating grids and actually using that for sort of positioning things to create your layout. So we need to know a little bit more terminology before we start positioning things. So Grid's quite different, as you can already see, from things that came before, and it does have this whole raft of new terminology and properties that come with it. So we talk about grid tracks. Now, a grid track is anything that is between two grid lines. So that could be horizontal or vertically. And once we define grid tracks, we get grid lines. So a grid with 3 column tracks has 4 lines, because you have one on the end as well. And they're numbered, starting with line 1. They can also be named. If you've got a gap, it acts just like a fat line in the grid. It's very like the column gap on multi-column layout. So you can't put anything into the gap. But in all other ways, a gap acts like a track. It's just a track that you can't put anything into. Those grid lines are indexed according to the writing mode of the document. So I'm working in English, which is a left to right language, so line number 1 is going to be on the left. If I was working in a right to left language, that would be reversed. Line number 1 would be at the other end. And we have grid cells. That is the smallest unit on the grid that we can place an item into. So conceptually, that's a bit like a table cell. Anyone who is as old as me and used tables for layout, then you can probably be thinking it's very similar to that. You've got a cell that you can place something into. And then we have an area. A grid area is any area on the grid bound by 4 grid lines. That can include many grid cells. So let's have a look at how we position things. I'm using here the repeat syntax, and I'm creating a grid with 3 column tracks of 1 fraction unit each. And I've set grid auto rows to 200 pixels so that any new rows that I create will be 200 pixels tall. So by default, things are laying out sort of in DOM order. So I've shown which number is which. We're just laying them out automatically on the grid. If I want to position item number 1, I can position that starting at grid column line 2 and ending at grid column line 4, row 1 to row 3. So that's that large block there on the right, which actually is first in the source order. I've just picked that up and I've positioned it on my grid. That's all 4 properties used for positioning. It's obviously a little bit verbose. So we've got shorthands, as you'd expect. So here we're using grid column, and the value before the line is the start, and the value after is the end. And we use a / to separate them. You can actually go a step further than this and use grid area, and actually use one line to specify the entire syntax. So the order of those values is grid row start, grid column start, grid row end, grid column end, which is actually the reverse of specifying padding and margin shorthands, which sounds weird until you think that grid can work kind of in both directions, left to right or right to left. And so it kind of has to be weird one way around or the other. So that's just the way it's been chosen to be specified. Personally, I think that's quite confusing to look at, particularly if you're using line numbers. And so the other shorthand, sort of specifying columns then rows, I think is a little bit more descriptive. But you can name these lines, which can then make it a little easier to use. So you can name the lines and then refer to them by name rather than by number. So that makes it easier than kind of remembering where things sat on the grid. So here I'm naming my lines. You use the square brackets, then a name that you've chosen, and then you have the size of the track. And remember that when naming lines, we're never naming the track itself. You're actually naming the line before or after. And then we can position the items. And here I'm using the line names instead of the numbers. But the effect is exactly the same. There's a little bit of magic in this line naming thing. You can name them anything you like, but if you name them -start and -end, Grid will create a named grid area of the main name used, so the part of that name that's before the -start and -end. You can then actually position an item right into that area by using grid area by name. And you can also create these named areas explicitly too, giving us a completely different positioning possibility. So I'm naming each card. And then instead of doing any line-based positioning, I use the grid template areas property and describe my layout as the value of that property. So you can actually see the layout described as the value of a property. It's been referred to as the ASCII art method of doing layout. It's actually quite a nice way to play around with layout and to prototype things. So there's a lot of new stuff. A lot of new stuff in this spec. It's a very big spec. And so I'm going to have a look now at how those examples play out used in some kind of real sort of examples, some simple examples of layout, but things that are actually realistic as to the type of things that we might want to build. Because I think as you see it unfold over some real layouts, it's an awful lot easier to understand what's going on. So let's start with a realistic example, creating a simple 2-column layout using this line-based placement. So something like this. Very, very simple layout, something that you could create using really all sorts of methods. And that's the HTML. So I've got a parent element with a class of wrapper. I've got 3 child elements. I've got a header, we've got this panel, and some content. So without any layout, they're going to lay out in line as you'd expect, and they'll look like this. So we've got the header there and the panel and the main content. So I'm going to create 2 columns, a 2-fraction unit 1 and a 4-fraction unit 1. So I divide the available space into 6, assign 2 units to the first column and 4 units to the second column. And we've also got these properties, grid column gap and grid row gap, to create gutters between our columns and our rows. And now I've done that, but I've not positioned anything, and so I end up with this. So you can see what's happened here is the grid has laid out the child items with the auto placement rules into each cell of the grid that we've created. So to position the items, the header has a class of main header. It spans across the grid from column line 1 to column line 3. It starts at row line 1, which is the first row. And then we have a panel, which is a sidebar, starting at the far left column line 1, ending at column line 2. It starts at grid row 2, which is the second row. And the content area just sits next to it. And we get this. And the panel has a grey background, which takes full height. It's not going to sort of sit up behind the text as it would if we were using floats. And that's because the panel and the main content are in the same row. So the background of the panel extends to the bottom of the row by default. It's using stretch just like Flexbox does, rather than being behind the content only. And it's this ability for kind of one element to react to there being something else in the layout. That's the cool thing really about Flexbox and Grid. Things kind of have relationship once they become Flex or Grid items. So if we overlay the grid, you can see it. And as I say, for later, when you're looking through these examples, you'll be able to find the full layout at those links. But I'll give you a link to the slides, and they've got those in. So I want to put a footer on the layout. I just add it to my markup and position it right across the layout. Again, we're starting at line 1, ending at line 3. And that then sits underneath the layout. And it wouldn't matter which of those columns was taller. We don't need to clear it. It's gone into its own row on the grid. Now, we weren't adding those rows. We didn't declare any rows. Grid has just created those rows for us. As I mentioned, we get this idea of the implicit grid. Grid is just putting items in as we add things into rows. It's creating new row tracks to hold that content. And I think that's going to be the case for an awful lot of layouts. You kind of want to specify the columns, but the rows, you just want them to be auto-sized. You just want stuff to go into rows as you need to add more of it. And when I showed you those grid cells, I said, it's a bit like a table. And I think anyone who ever designed a site using tables for layout is probably thinking in the way that I am about how that worked. There are key differences. Unlike a table for layout, Grid doesn't rely on your content being kind of chopped up in the source in the way that tables did. If you ever remember kind of fragmenting images and things so you could display them in tables. But also, because everything's described in CSS, you can redefine the grid. You can add a grid at any breakpoint, or you could take it away, or you could redefine where things sit on a grid at any breakpoint, right there in your CSS, which obviously isn't something you could do with tables for layout. So if, for instance, we had the same HTML that we had before and we thought, let's make this into a responsive layout, starting mobile first, I might just use Grid at the mobile version to kind of rearrange things slightly. I think it would actually be better if the content came above the panel for mobile. So I could do that by creating a one-column track grid and rearranging things. It's important to note this doesn't rearrange things sort of logically. If you want to logically reorder, in terms of making sure the source is accessible, you need to make sure you go back and rearrange your source. It's visual only, and it's the same for Flexbox. So for narrow widths, I've got this. And then we add some media queries, redefine the grid, and go back to our two-column grid with the header and footer. So Grid makes it pretty easy to play around with things within media queries, which is really nice. It's nice to be able to kind of fine-tune layouts at different breakpoints, and know you can just do that in your CSS. You don't need to go back and add things to the markup to do it. So that was positioning with the numbers. We'll have a quick look at doing the same thing, but using line names. So again, I want to create the same layout, and this one will be here. So this time, I'm defining that single column layout, and when I do that, I define the row lines. So I'm saying row header start, row content start, row panel start, and row footer start, and you can say row footer end as well. And positioning the items for the mobile width is exactly the same. We go from this to this. And if you look at the example online, I've expanded that out to the two-column layout as well. So I think actually naming lines is a pretty good idea. If you're working, particularly if you're working with responsive layout, you kind of want content to always be in the same place in terms of where you're positioning it. You don't want people to have to keep track of, well, which line number is content right now. So it's much easier if you name the line in the grid, then you can just, you know you're safe to kind of position things against it. However, what's even neater really is this method, this ASCII art method of using named areas, using grid template areas and positioning elements into areas on the grid. And we'll have a look at that again with the same markup. So outside of the media queries, we need to set up some names. So for each of our elements, I've got the header and the content, the panel and the footer. I'm giving them a name. That's just an ident. It can be anything you like. So I'm using header, content, sidebar, footer. You could name bits of your grid, anything you like, whatever makes sense for your design. And we're using the grid area property for this, which is the same property that's used for that very short one-line, line-based shorthand. So, mobile width, single column layout with the rows separated by a 10-pixel gutter, to say display grid, set a row gap, and then we've got header, content, sidebar, footer in order. That's all we need to do to create our layout. We end up with this. And there's the named areas overlaid. And wider layout with media queries. And once again, we're describing the layout in this kind of ASCII art manner. And then we end up with this. And that's with the areas overlaid. This is a really, really nice way to work. I've been playing around with this for really a few years now, and I've been using it for prototyping. I do a lot of UI design for our CMS. And although I'm having to rebuild all the stuff at the moment and things that work, it's actually such a lovely way just to prototype, just to see how things work responsively, because it's so easy to move things around. So it's been great fun to use as a prototyping method. A couple of things to note. If you repeat a name, that causes the element to span the cells. So here I've repeated header and footer across, so it spans as many. It has to be a rectangular area that you're creating. You can't do something strange like repeat the item in 2 different places and it appear, or create an L shape, unfortunately. Not quite yet. So you need to create a rectangle with your areas. But yeah, if you want to span as many as you like, you can repeat the name. You can have multiple white space in between the names, and that is purely so you can line up your ASCII art. To leave a cell empty, use a full stop or multiple full stops again, so you can line things up. And that will just leave a cell empty. So if I here have the full stop and then footer only once, then what we get is the footer sitting under the content and that cell just being left empty. So I say that's a really nice thing to play around with. More and more I'm sort of using that method as I build things with Grid. And so when we use these named areas, it's worth noting you always have lines. You always have line numbering. So even if you're using named areas, you're using named lines, you've always got your line numbers. You can always still use them. You can mix the two methods. But we get these implicit named grid lines. So that's our layout as before. But because we've got a named area called content, Grid creates for us content start and content end. And we get that for the footer as well. We get footer start and footer end. So if I create, I've got a div in the markup, I give it a class of test and give it a background color so I can see it, and I position it on the column content start and on grid row content start and footer end, we end up with this block overlaying the markup because we can actually position things using those implicit named lines that Grid's created for us. What this also shows is that you can layer things up on the grid because that's actually spanning over, just sitting right on top of the rest of the layout. And we can just use z-index, just like you would with absolute positioning, to stack things up on your grid. I think there's all sorts of interesting things that could be done by layering things up that are different shapes on grids. So there are some very simple layouts. I think that probably most people, when they think of Grid initially, are thinking of something like the Bootstrap or the Foundation Grid, these kind of 12-column, 16-column flexible grids that we're using a lot of the time to sort of create order in our designs. And it was one of the first things I wanted to do when I started looking with Grid layout was, well, can I replicate something like that with Grid? Now, I think that the sort of Bootstrap and Foundation type grids, or the standalone ones, work pretty well. They save us from an awful lot of the kind of working out the math and so on when we're doing layout. But they're conceptually pretty heavy because we are describing a lot of the time our layout in markup, or at the very least, we're tying it into our Sass. So even if you're not that bothered about presentational classes getting into your markup, there's only so far you can go with stuffing breakpoint information into HTML. You do have to sort of go back to it or go back to your Sass to make changes. And so with Grid layout, we're defining our layout in the CSS. We don't necessarily need to add classes to the markup. And we've also got this ability to redefine where things are at any time. And what this means is that if we're thinking about can I replace the Bootstrap grid? Can I replace Suzy or whatever it is that you're using with grid layout? It's a kind of slightly different way of thinking. So to sort of work through this, I'm using the skeleton framework, which is essentially a lightweight CSS framework that includes a grid. It's just a bit simpler than Bootstrap to use for a demo, but it's very much the same concept. So this is their example on the skeleton site, this sort of grid example they've got. And then here's the markup from one of their demos. So you can see that we're adding divs with a class for rows, and then we're stating the number of columns that an area can span. So again, very similar to other things like this. So that markup gives you a little grid that looks like this, and that uses the default skeleton grid. So for the grid version, I first removed all the row divs. I shouldn't need those with grid. And I've removed the kind of presentational classes. Again, I shouldn't need those. I'm just using box 1, box 2, because I've got no semantics in this markup. It's just an example. But they could be semantic class names. But the important thing is I've removed any description of how the grid works from the markup itself. I then create my grid. This, again, looks just like a slightly more complex declaration because we're using repeat. We're also naming the lines. And because I'm naming a repeating line, col, I'm going to end up with 12 of them. I'm going to have multiple lines called the same thing. And this turns out to be pretty useful. Because we can place items on that grid. So I'm using this name line syntax. I'm saying grid column col. That will be the first line named col. And I'm introducing a span keyword here. So I'm saying just span 4. So start on col, span 4. It's then going into the first row lines, the first line named row. If I want to place box 8, this time I'm going to say start on the first line named col, the 7th line named col, and span 3. And this time start on row 3. So we can just say name, number. So you can say col 7, and then we can use this span keyword. The nice thing about using the span keyword is you don't have to worry about where things sort of start. You don't have to think, oh, it's got to start on col 7 and end on col 13. You just say, well, it needs to span however many. And we work through and we develop this. So, and all of this is online, so you can have a look. So you can easily replicate the sort of stuff that we're doing with Bootstrap with grid layout. But grid lets us go a step further, because you don't just have to span the columns with grid, you can also span rows. We can span rows in exactly the same way that we span columns. So here I'm saying span 2 rows and span 3 rows on a couple of these items. And in the third example, I span columns and I span rows, something which is very, very difficult to do with float-based layouts because things always end up sort of popping up behind the content. So a more realistic example of that, once you've got a grid framework, you tend to want to lay things out in a grid framework rather than build little examples. So I'm now going to rebuild the layout we were building earlier, but build it on our new skeleton-inspired grid. So the header and footer start at the first line named col and span to line 12. The header starts after the first row line and the footer the third. And between them, we've got the panel and the content after row line 2. The panel is the sort of sidebar, it spans 4 lines, and the content takes the rest of the width. That's the layout. And then we end up with this again. So it's pretty easy to play around with this using this kind of framework that we've created. So perhaps instead of a full width footer, I'd like the panel to go right down to the bottom and the footer just to sit under the text. And really, you just have to change 3 bits of the CSS to do that. And we end up with this. So it's very easy to play around with this grid layout that we've created, and we don't have to go and change stuff in the markup to do it. So that's all you need for your layout based on grid. That's it, no framework. I've not included any other CSS to do that. That's it. The framework is really the definition. So grid itself is being a framework for you. But saying that, like Flexbox, I'm absolutely sure that in a couple of months, we will see everybody posting to GitHub their grid layout-based grid frameworks. If you're going to do that, think about whether that abstraction actually is worth anything. Or are you just changing the names of stuff? Because ultimately, CSS Grid Layout is a grid framework built right into the browser. So if you're going to start sort of adding things on top of it, they need to add value somewhere. Or maybe there's something that you should report to the CSS working group so we can see if it can go into level 2. So back at the start of the talk, I showed examples of creating a grid with sets of boxes that position themselves on the grid without any placement properties. The rules around this auto placement are defined by the grid item placement algorithm. You can go and look at that in the spec. There's an awful lot of it because it tells browsers how they're supposed to lay this stuff out. It's reasonably interesting to read through, but yeah, there's quite a lot of it. And not all of it's that relevant to us. The other thing about auto placement is you need to know that it's going to happen because anything you don't position is going to be automatically placed, which is what happened when we first created a grid but hadn't positioned anything. There's also places where auto placement is pretty useful. So I've got a list here with a bunch of images in it, a sort of standard gallery type thing. The UL element has a class of wrapper. And if I create a grid with 4 equal columns on the UL, if I don't give any positioning information, the images and their sort of titles there, which have just got a number in, they lay themselves out on the grid, 1 in each cell, and they're all 1 fraction unit. So obviously our portrait images are quite tall, and we've got the landscape ones, and they're quite small. It'd be much nicer if those landscape images would take 2 tracks, because then everything would be a bit more in proportion. So what I've got is I've just added a class of landscape to any landscape image as its output. And I'm just saying grid column end span 2. So if grid finds a landscape image, I'd like it to span 2 tracks. And so we get this. So the auto placement algorithm starts laying the things out. It finds this first portrait image. That doesn't have a class. That takes 1 cell. We get a landscape image, which goes over 2 tracks. And then it has to leave a gap because we've got this another landscape image. Well, that has to go on to the next line. And so it just lays it all out. It keeps everything in DOM order, but it makes our landscape images a bit bigger. And I'm saying it keeps everything in DOM order unless we add a property of grid auto flow with a value of dense. Now grid will backfill the gaps. So as it moves to the content, it leaves that space because the next image is too big. The image afterwards that it comes across is like, oh, well, I've got a gap for that image, picks it up and pops it into the gap, which is very, very cool for your image gallery, not so much for your form. I'll come back to that later. So something that gets asked a lot, it's probably the sort of top question after talks, which is why I put this into this talk. People keep asking me, is grid a competing specification to Flexbox? Which is a very odd question. I'm not sure where this comes from. People have got this idea that the CSS working group are creating some kind of layout deathmatch where these things are going to fight it out, and we'll see which one wins. It's not the case. They're essentially things that are going to work together. And they actually include common features. And we've already seen a little bit of how things stretch to the height of their row, and that behavior is very like Flexbox. And that's because it's using the same properties, the same alignment properties that Flexbox does. And this is where we get the box alignment module level 3. Because what this is, it's all that cool stuff that's in Flexbox that lets you align things, that lets you do vertical centering, that lets things stretch to the height of the tallest. It's all of those things extracted and put into their own module. The advantage of things going into their own module is that they can then be used by other modules. At the moment, that's been implemented in Grid Layout, but there's actually no reason why other types of layout, block layouts, so floating things and so on, couldn't also have those properties applied to them in the future. So if you've used Flexbox, you'll know that if we make our items flex items, we set the display property to flex on the parent. So in this case, I've got an ordered list. I'm using the flex property. And if I were creating the same layout with grid, it would look like this, display grid, and we get a 4-column grid, each column of equal width. So in both cases, the flex container height or the grid row height is being defined by that tall portrait image. And in both cases, the default alignment is stretch, so items stretch to the height of the tallest. So here I'm using these values in the box alignment property to align the 3 landscape images in the space created by the tall image. So for Flexbox, you center an item by setting align self to center. To align the item to the start, I use Flex Start, and to the end, Flex End. And for Grid, we have align self center again. We have self start and self end, because it's not a flex container. But exactly the same alignment is going on there. So that was an example where Grid and Flexbox work in pretty much the same way. In production, you could use either. It wouldn't matter which you'd use for that kind of layout. So what's the key difference between the two? And it's really this. If you're laying things out as a column or a row, then Flexbox works really well for that. The row might wrap, but each row is going to become its own flex container. If you want to control both columns and rows at the same time, that's where you need Grid. And this is kind of the standard example of that. If we wrap a set of items using Flexbox, I've got a flex basis here of 200 pixels. The items can grow and shrink. We're allowing them to wrap. And if I've got 5 items, as they wrap there, there's not enough space for them all in one row, so they wrap round. We've got 3 on the top. They've wrapped. They've gone on the bottom. The space distribution happens across the rows. They split the difference. And there isn't really a good way, without kind of starting to nobble the flex properties, of making card 4 and 5 line up under card 1 and 2. If you want to do that, that's where you need Grid, because you're trying to control both rows and columns at the same time. So with Grid, we'd end up with this, controlling the entire grid in our definition, flowing the items into it, and we get that. So here, Grid's autofilling the content into the cells of the grid. And it'll just put one item into one cell unless we actually start to specify spans. Another way of thinking about it is that Flexbox kind of works from the content out. So you have some items, you say, well, I want these things spaced out evenly. That's a Flexbox thing. With Grid, you're creating a grid, and then you're forcing the stuff into the shape of that grid. So that's kind of the other way of looking at it, is whether you're working for the content out or whether you're defining a grid and putting things into it. Here's a very quick example of how Grid and Flexbox might kind of work together for an existing layout. This is from the Envato Tuts Plus website. They had this common navigation pattern of fixed height blocks. The only way to do this sort of thing is to have absolute heights on things. So the minute you add more content, you kind of end up with a broken layout. And in the real world, sometimes people put more content into boxes than you expected. So I kind of wanted to see if Grid would help us out with this kind of pattern. And it turns out it can. So here's the layout I created, which very much mirrors that existing layout there. So I'm redefining the grid at 2 breakpoints after my initial mobile width, going to either 2 or 3 columns. The thing to note is that while the heights of those rows appear fixed at 150 pixels, as soon as I add extra content, the whole row expands down to include that content, to contain it, and stop it from sort of breaking out of the box. So the stories to the left of this story about angry people at Balloon Fiestas have also got taller to make space for the extra content. And the whole panel all still lines up at the bottom. And this works by using the min-max function in my track sizing. So I mentioned earlier that Grid Auto Rows gives a height to the rows that Grid creates in the implicit grid. So I'm using min-max here to get a track that is at least 150 pixels tall, which is what I want for my design. I'd like my tracks to be 150 pixels tall, but it has a maximum of auto. So if more content is added, then the layout expands to contain the content. So although my design says I'd like these things to be 150 pixels, Grid is kind of behaving, so it understands the real world of content, and it expands out. It allows you to create these precise-looking layouts with a built-in tolerance for additional content. And I then use Flexbox inside my areas to push content to the bottom of cells, to do little bits of alignment, which is what Flexbox is really good at. As another note, I've mentioned about having the implicit grid. In the real world, you sometimes have content editors and content management systems that don't restrict them from adding extra things that you didn't expect them to add. In this case, someone's added an extra box They've added too many of these navigation points, and yeah, that's not what I wanted in my design, but it's not broken. It's not ended up overlaying the content. It's not going to look too much of a mess until someone comes along and says, hang on, that's not what we wanted, and tidies it up. But it's not going to look terribly broken. I did mention that when we're able to start pulling things out of DOM order, that's a little bit scary. We could cause all sorts of problems. And I think that as a community, we need to start thinking about what Grid and Flexbox do in terms of the accessibility of our documents. I mean, ideally, they should let us create the most accessible source documents, really great source documents, and then use the sort of power of reordering to display things in the most optimal way for each breakpoint, still testing to make sure we're not doing things like breaking the ability to tab around a document. I think there is a worry that people will kind of forget about source order once they can just drag things around. Even worse, because elements only become Flex or Grid items if they are a direct child of the container, I think there is a temptation, maybe not for individual developers, but certainly for authoring tools, JavaScript frameworks, to start flattening out the DOM to make it easier to use Grid. And this is something that we definitely need to take care of as we're using this stuff. It's all over the specifications that we certainly shouldn't be damaging source order, but it's something I think to think about and something I like to make sure is mentioned in these presentations. There's a few good examples online. This is some from Adrian Raleigh, some examples of how Grid and other layout methods and how tab order works in those. And this is a fantastic presentation by Leonie Watson, who uses a screen reader herself, and she explains a bit about, mainly with Flexbox, but it's exactly the same sort of issues, you know, how they affect accessibility. Would very, very much encourage people to have a look at that. So, loads of lovely cool stuff. The bad news, where are we with browsers? So, this specification is now a candidate recommendation, which means it's pretty much finished. If you go to Can I Use, you will see this, and you will say, what? Internet Explorer only? And right, so this specification originated with the IE team, and there is an experimental prefixed version of it in IE10, IE11, and Edge. Edge have said that updating Grid to new spec, it's marked as a high priority in their backlog, so hopefully at some point they're going to update. You can see all the little flags on all of the other browsers, and that's because Grid has been developed behind feature flags in really all of the browsers. An interesting note to this story is that for a long time my examples only worked in Chrome or Opera behind a flag, and that Blink implementation has been underway for 3 years, being done by a consultancy called Igalia, not by people at Google. They're open source consultancy. The work on Grid has been sponsored by Bloomberg, who have also paid for Grid to go into WebKit, which means it's in the Safari Developer Preview. So we don't know when that will actually land in Safari proper, but there's a fairly good chance that yes, it will at some point. Mozilla, they started implementing later, but they came on very, very quickly with their implementation. It's pretty much at the same level as Blink. Now when I'm testing, I tend to find that, you know, Mozilla's fixed something, then it will be fixed in Blink, and Blink moves ahead a bit. So they're pretty much on a par, though, at this point. This changes a lot, pretty much every time I update my browser. So I keep this page on Grid by Example up to date with what is happening. That's also got links to all the meta bugs, all the implementation bugs for Grid, so you can go and have a look. So this is interoperability. This is browser vendors all working together to bring us Grid layout in a complete state. So when those flags are removed, it's going to be there, and it's going to be there pretty much cross-browser, which is very exciting and very different to how other things have come out in the past. And so this is why I'm talking about something that we can't use yet, because while the thing is behind a flag, it is the kind of last chance for us to say, hey, there's a problem with this, or there are bugs, or finding bugs in browsers, and getting this stuff out there. And this is going to be the way of specs in the future. They're going to happen behind browser flags. We're going to have to toggle those flags and get involved with developing specs at the point at which we can actually make a difference. And I really can't stress enough. It is pretty easy these days, with all the specs on GitHub. It's pretty easy for individual developers to have a look and pass comment and add their thoughts. so much of the stuff on GitHub will be the CSS working group saying, what should we call this property? Because often we don't really know. And feedback from people who say are from a traditional graphic design background, that could be really useful and might save us calling something really silly that everyone's going to complain about for years. So do have a look at the stuff that's going by on GitHub. It's quite interesting. And it really is a good deed for your future developing self to offer feedback to specs. And as one of the representations of kind of us on the working group, I'm very keen to try and get as much feedback from other people like me as possible so we can make the specifications better. As I say, I'll give you a link to my slides, and there is also tons and tons of code at gridbyexample.com and some videos. I'm going to put some more videos up so you can go and have a look at the stuff I've been building. It's a big spec, broken down. It's not as sort of daunting as you might think. But thank you very much for listening. I know it's lots of information. I hope you enjoyed it.